My wife stood in the marble foyer of the home I paid for. She smoothed her red dress and looked me in the eye. She said, "I'm going on a date. Don't wait up." She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to beg. Instead, I smiled and said, "I was hoping you'd say that." Her face went pale. She didn't know I had already found the offshore accounts. She didn't know I had the surveillance photos. And she certainly didn't know that by morning, she would have nothing. My wife smirked at me. She stood in the entryway of our home, the one with the high ceilings and the marble floors that echoed when you walked on them. She was wearing a burgundy dress I had never seen before. It hugged her frame perfectly. It was the kind of dress that cost more than $2,000. Her makeup was flawless. Too flawless for a Tuesday night. She checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusted a diamond earring, and then looked at me. There was no guilt in her eyes. There was only a cold, sharp challenge. She said, "I am going on a date. Do not wait up." She let the words hang in the air. She wanted a reaction. She expected me to crumble. She expected the man who had loved her for 18 years to beg her to stay. She wanted the drama. She wanted to be the prize I had to fight for. I stood by the kitchen island. The granite was cold under my fingertips. I looked at the microwave clock. It was 7:30 in the evening. I looked back at her. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply took a sip of my water and replied, "I was hoping you would say that." Her smirk vanished. It was instant. Her face went pale, draining of color like someone had pulled a plug. The arrogance that she wore like a second skin dissolved. She blinked, once, twice. She looked like a computer trying to reboot after a critical error. She stammered for a second. She asked me what I meant, but I did not answer. I just stared at her, because she did not know what I knew. She did not know that the game she thought she was winning was already over. My name is Jason. I am 44 years old. Until 3 months ago, I thought I had the perfect life. I built a business from nothing. Ironclad athletics. It was not just a gym. It was an empire. We had 5 luxury locations across the Chicago metro area. We brought in over $2 million a year in profit. I had a beautiful wife, Elena. We had 2 great kids, a son who was 17 and a daughter who was 14. I had a business partner, Gavin, whom I trusted with my life. Gavin handled the marketing and the sales. I handled the operations. We were a team, or so I thought. Elena had been with me since the beginning, back when we were eating cheap noodles in a studio apartment. She stuck by me when I poured every cent of our savings into that first location. I thought she believed in me. But success changes people. Or maybe it just reveals who they really are. The cracks started appearing 3 months ago. It was subtle at first. Small things. A credit card statement with a charge for a hotel in the city on a Thursday. A dinner bill for 2 at an Italian restaurant called Marcello's, a place I had not visited in years. Then there were the withdrawals. Cash. $500 here. $800 there. It added up. It was systematic. But I am a businessman. I deal in data. I deal in facts. I did not confront her immediately. I watched. I waited. The breaking point was yesterday. My son had a championship basketball game. He scored 23 points. Elena was not there. She texted me saying she was covering the front desk at our downtown location because an employee called in sick. It was a lie. I knew it was a lie because I installed a high-definition security system in all our gyms 6 months ago. I can access every camera from my phone. I watched the feed from the downtown gym all night. Elena never walked through those doors. But last night, I found something worse than infidelity. I was going through the business accounts, the ones Gavin and I shared. I noticed a transfer. $5,000 labeled as equipment maintenance. I checked the vendor list. The vendor did not exist. The account number for the transfer routed directly to a private holding account. I ran a trace. The account belonged to Elena. My hands shook when I realized what was happening. This was not just an affair. This was theft. Calculated, cold-blooded theft. My wife and my best friend were stealing from me. They were siphoning money from the company I built to fund their little romantic getaways. I spent the entire night digging. I went back 6 months, then a year. The total was staggering. Over $50,000 in unauthorized transfers and cash withdrawals. But here's the twist. Here is the part that made my blood run cold and turned my sadness into pure, tactical rage. While digging through the cloud drive that Gavin insisted we use for efficiency, I found a folder. It was mislabeled. Inside was a draft of a legal document. It was dated for tomorrow morning. It was a motion to remove me as CEO of Ironclad Athletics. They were planning a hostile takeover. They were going to use the stolen money to buy out my voting shares at a reduced price, citing mismanagement. They were going to steal my company, my money, and my dignity. So when Elena stood in the hallway in that $2,000 dress and told me she was going on a date, I knew exactly where she was going. She was not going to dinner with friends. She was meeting Gavin. They were meeting their lawyer to finalize the paperwork to destroy me the next morning. She looked at me, recovering her composure. She said I was being dramatic. She said I was paranoid. She grabbed her purse, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather. She told me she would be back late. I told her to take her time. I told her I had some calls to make anyway. The door clicked shut behind her. The sound echoed through the house. For a moment, I stood alone in the silence. The smell of her perfume lingered in the air. It made me sick. But then, a strange feeling washed over me. It was not grief. It was clarity. Pure, sharp, undeniable clarity. I had been playing defense for months, wondering what was wrong, wondering if I was crazy. Now I knew the enemy. And the enemy was careless. I pulled out my phone. I opened my banking app. It was 8 o'clock at night. I had less than 12 hours before their meeting. If they wanted a war, I would give them a war. But I would not fight it on their terms. I would not fight with shouting matches and tears. I would fight with leverage. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The first thing I did was access the joint accounts. I transferred 90% of our liquid savings into a separate trust account I had set up that afternoon. It was an account for the children's education, untouchable by her. Next, I logged into the business administration portal. As the majority shareholder and original founder, I had administrator privileges that Gavin often forgot about. I initiated a lockout protocol, but I needed more. I needed to cut the head off the snake. I knew Gavin's finances were shaky. He liked fast cars and expensive watches. He lived paycheck to paycheck on a salary of $300,000 a year. I made a call to a friend of mine who worked in private equity. I asked him to look up Gavin's outstanding debts. The answer came back within 20 minutes. Gavin was leveraged to the hilt. He owed huge sums on his condo and his car. I sat in the dark kitchen, the blue light of the laptop illuminating my face. My son came downstairs. He looked tired. He asked where Mom was. I looked at him. He was 17, almost a man. He deserved the truth, or at least a version of it he could handle. I told him Mom had to go out for a meeting. He looked at me with eyes that knew too much. He asked if everything was okay. I told him that everything was going to be different, but we would be okay. After he went back to bed, I made the most important move of the night. I called my attorney, Richard. Richard was a shark in a three-piece suit. He picked up on the second ring. I told him to meet me at the office in an hour. I told him to bring the partnership agreement and a notary. What is the emergency, Jason? Richard asked, his voice groggy. There is no emergency, I said, my voice steady. There is an opportunity. Gavin and Elena are planning to force me out tomorrow at 9 in the morning. I need to restructure the company bylaws before the sun comes up. Richard was silent for a moment. Then he said, I will see you in 45 minutes. I stood up. I walked to the front door. I looked at the lock. It was a smart lock, connected to my phone. I opened the app. I found Elena's user profile. Her digital key. With one tap of my finger, I revoked her access. She said she was going on a date. She said not to wait up. I was not going to wait up. When she came back tonight, expecting to sneak into her warm bed after plotting my destruction, she would find that her key no longer worked. She would find her clothes and bags on the porch. And she would find that the husband she thought was a fool had just become her worst nightmare. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. I had a business to save, and I had a partner to bury. The night was just beginning. The drive to my attorney's office in downtown Chicago felt like a funeral procession for the man I used to be. The highway was a ribbon of concrete illuminated by the harsh orange glow of streetlights, cutting through the darkness. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck until my knuckles turned white, the leather creaking under the pressure. I did not play music. I needed the silence. I needed to hear the engine hum and the blood rushing in my ears. Every mile marker I passed was another step away from the naive husband who trusted blindly and toward the man who was about to burn his own world down just to kill the parasites living inside it. Richard was waiting for me in his office on the 42nd floor. The building was a tower of glass and steel, a fortress of silence at this hour. He had a pot of black coffee brewing and a stack of files spread across his mahogany desk. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. He was a man who lived for conflict, and I was about to hand him the biggest war of his career. I sat down and did not waste time with pleasantries. I slid the flash drive across the desk. It contained everything: the bank statements, the surveillance footage, the shadow logs from the company server, and the draft of their hostile takeover plan. We spent the next 3 hours dissecting the corpse of my marriage and my partnership. Richard read through the operating agreement of Ironclad Athletics, a document we had signed 7 years ago. He found the weapon we needed in Section 12, Paragraph 4, the Morality and Fiduciary Duty Clause. It stated explicitly that any partner found to be engaging in criminal activity or gross negligence that financially harmed the company could be removed immediately by a majority vote of the remaining equity holders. Since Gavin and I were the only 2 equity holders, it seemed like a stalemate. But Richard pointed out the tiebreaker provision. In the event of a deadlock where one partner is accused of theft with material evidence, the accused partner's voting rights are suspended pending a forensic audit. That was the key: suspended voting rights. I gave the order to initiate the forensic audit immediately. Richard drafted the emergency motion. We were not just going to defend my position, we were going to counterattack. I authorized Richard to contact the bank and freeze the corporate credit lines. Gavin relied on those credit lines to float his lifestyle. By morning, his cards would be nothing more than useless plastic. But I wanted more. I wanted to ensure Gavin had no escape route. I instructed Richard to purchase the promissory note on Gavin's personal loan from a private lender I knew. It cost me a premium, but by 3 in the morning, I was no longer just Gavin's partner. I was his creditor. He owed me $300,000, and I had the legal right to call that debt in immediately due to the change in his employment status, which I was about to engineer. While Richard finalized the paperwork, I opened my laptop to handle the digital front. I logged into the Ironclad administrative mainframe. I could see the activity logs. Gavin was currently logged in from a remote IP address, likely from the hotel room where he and my wife were celebrating my premature demise. I watched his cursor move across the screen in real time, ghosting his session. He was accessing the client database, probably downloading our high-value member list to leverage it later. I let him continue for another 10 minutes. I wanted the log files to show the data exfiltration. It was more evidence of corporate espionage. Once he had downloaded a significant amount, I struck. I executed a command I had written years ago but never used. It was a kill switch for remote access. Instantly, the connection was severed. I changed the admin passwords. I enabled 2-factor authentication routed solely to my device. I locked down the email servers. I watched the active session counter drop to 1, just me. They were blind. They were deaf. And they were locked out. I left Richard's office at 4 in the morning. The city was still asleep, unaware of the violence that had just occurred in the digital space. I drove back to the suburbs, to the house that was no longer a home. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I pulled into the driveway and saw that the house was dark. Elena was not back yet. The date was going long. They were probably toasting to their victory, unaware that the champagne they were drinking was bought with money they no longer had access to. I entered the house and went straight to the master bedroom. I did not cry. I did not reminisce. I pulled 2 large suitcases from the closet. I opened her drawers and began to pack. I did not pack everything. I packed the essentials: clothes, shoes, toiletries. I moved with the efficiency of a machine. I stripped the bed we shared and threw the sheets into the trash. I would sleep in the guest room tonight. Once the bags were packed, I carried them downstairs and set them on the front porch. I placed them neatly, side by side, like luggage waiting for a bellboy. Then, I re-engaged the security system. I set the perimeter alarm to instant. I changed the master code. I disabled the garage door openers. I sat in the living room chair, facing the window, and watched the street. She arrived at 5:15 in the morning. I saw the headlights of an Uber sweep across the front lawn. She stepped out, looking disheveled but happy. She was humming to herself. She walked up the path, her heels clicking on the stone. She reached for the door handle and pulled. It was locked. She frowned, confused. She dug into her purse for her keys. She inserted her key into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. I had not changed the physical cylinder, but the electronic deadbolt was engaged from the inside. overriding the manual key. She tried the code on the keypad. The keypad flashed red. Access denied. I watched her through the living room window, hidden by the sheer curtains. Her confusion turned to frustration, then to panic. She rang the doorbell. Once, twice, 10 times. The chime echoed through the silent house, but I did not move. I just sat there, sipping my coffee, watching the woman who tried to destroy me realize that she was the one who was homeless. She pulled out her phone. I saw the screen light up her face. She was calling me. My phone vibrated on the table next to me. I let it ring. She called again, and again. Then she started pounding on the door. She was screaming now, yelling my name, demanding to be let in. She looked ridiculous in her expensive dress, banging on the door of a house she had forfeited the moment she decided to steal from our family. Then came the flashing lights. She had called the police. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb. I stood up then. This was the moment. I walked to the front door and opened it before the officers could knock. Elena tried to push past me, screaming that I was crazy, that I had locked her out. I blocked her path with my arm, calm and immovable. The officer, a young man who looked like he had seen too many domestic disputes, asked what was going on. I did not shout. I did not get emotional. I simply handed him a folder I had prepared. Inside was a copy of the bank transfers showing the $50,000 she had stolen. There was a printout of the text messages between her and Gavin conspiring to defraud the business. And there was a copy of the deed to the house, which was in my name, purchased before our marriage. I explained to the officer that there was a significant theft of funds and that I felt unsafe with her in the home. I explained that this was not a marital spat, but a crime scene, and I was preserving the integrity of my property. I pointed to the bags on the porch. I told him she was free to take her belongings and leave, but she was not entering the premises. Elena shrieked, trying to play the victim. She cried about her children. She cried about her rights. But the officer looked at the bank statements. He looked at the evidence of the grand larceny. He looked at my calm demeanor and her hysterical state. He told her that given the allegations of theft and the volatile situation, she needed to leave for the night. He told her it was a civil matter to be settled in court, but for now, she had to go. I watched as the reality shattered her. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. She realized then that the husband she thought was weak, the man she called safe and boring, had just outmaneuvered her completely. The officer escorted her to the squad car to give her a ride to her mother's house. She grabbed her suitcases, her mascara running down her cheeks. As the police car pulled away, taking my wife out of my life, I closed the door and locked it. The silence returned to the house. It was the first peaceful moment I had felt in months. The first battle was won, but the war for my company and for my children was just beginning, and I was ready for the boardroom slaughter that would happen in 4 hours. I arrived at the headquarters of Ironclad Athletics at 7 in the morning. The office was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed my personal life only hours before. I walked past the empty cubicles of the sales team and the marketing department, the very people Gavin was supposed to be leading but had instead been neglecting while he destroyed my marriage. I entered the boardroom, the glass-walled sanctuary where we had signed our original partnership agreement 7 years ago. The city of Chicago sprawled out beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows, a grid of gray and steel waking up to a gloomy Wednesday. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, the seat that Gavin intended to take from me in less than 2 hours. I laid out my weapons on the polished wood surface. To my left, the forensic audit report Richard and I had compiled, detailing every cent of the $52,000 stolen from the company accounts. To my right, the purchase agreement for Gavin's personal debt, the $300,000 promissory note that made me the owner of his financial future. And in the center, the motion to dissolve his employment and strip him of his equity based on the morality and fiduciary duty clause. I poured a cup of black coffee and waited. I was the spider in the center of the web, and the fly was buzzing its way up the elevator. Gavin walked in at 8:55. He looked like a man who thought he had already won. He was wearing a suit that cost more than most of my employees made in a month, and he carried a leather portfolio that I knew contained the motion to remove me as CEO. He did not look like a man who had spent the night panicking about his lover being locked out of her house. He looked confident. He likely assumed Elena was just being dramatic or that I was simply acting out of hurt feelings. He had no idea that I had spent the night dissecting his life. He sat down at the opposite end of the table. He smirked at me, that same arrogant tilt of the lips that he shared with my wife. He opened his portfolio and began to speak. He launched into a rehearsed speech about the direction of the company. He talked about how my conservative management style was holding us back. He claimed that the board needed fresh leadership to expand into new markets. He used buzzwords like synergy and dynamic growth, words that meant absolutely nothing coming from a man who had not looked at a balance sheet in 6 months. He laid his document on the table and declared that he was calling for a vote of no confidence in my leadership. He stated that as a 40% shareholder, and with the proxy support of the silent investors he claimed to have rallied, he had the numbers to force me out. I let him finish. I let him enjoy the sound of his own voice for 10 minutes. I watched him gloat. I watched him reach for the pitcher of water, his hand steady, his confidence absolute. When he finally stopped speaking and looked at me, expecting anger or begging, I simply took a sip of my coffee and reached for the folder on my left. I slid the forensic audit across the long table. It spun slowly and stopped right in front of him. I told him to open it to page 4. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He opened the folder. I watched his face as he read the lines I had highlighted in yellow. The unauthorized transfers to Elena's shell account, the cash withdrawals from the petty cash fund, the charges for the hotel rooms, and the dinners at Marcello's. I explained calmly that under Section 12 of our operating agreement, any partner found to be engaging in theft or fraud immediately forfeits their voting rights pending an external investigation. I informed him that the investigation had already begun and that the forensic accountants were currently imaging his hard drive in the server room. His voting power was not 40%. It was 0. The silent investors he claimed to have were irrelevant because a criminal cannot sit on the board of Ironclad Athletics. Gavin turned pale. The confidence drained out of him like water from a cracked glass. He stammered, trying to find an excuse. He claimed it was a misunderstanding. He said the transfers were for consulting fees. He tried to lie, but the numbers on the page were absolute. They were the cold, hard truth that he could not charm his way out of. But I was not done. I told him that theft was a criminal matter, and I was prepared to file charges with the district attorney that afternoon. However, I told him there was another issue we needed to discuss. I slid the second document across the table, the black folder. He opened it with shaking hands. He stared at the promissory note. He looked up at me, confusion warring with fear in his eyes. He asked what this was. I told him that I knew he was over-leveraged. I knew he was 3 months behind on his mortgage and that his luxury car was weeks away from repossession. I explained that at 4 in the morning, I had purchased his debt from his private lender. I was now his creditor. And since he was about to be terminated for cause, triggering the immediate repayment clause in his loan agreement, he owed me $340,000. Payable immediately. The silence in the room was deafening. The hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. Gavin slumped in his chair. He looked small. The suit suddenly looked too big for him. He realized the trap he had walked into. He had come here to steal my company, and instead, he had lost his job, his reputation, and his financial freedom in the span of 15 minutes. I stood up and walked over to the window. I looked out at the city I had conquered. I did not look at him when I delivered the final blow. I told him he had 2 choices. Option 1. He could sign the voluntary resignation papers on the table, surrender his equity to settle the debt he owed me, and walk away with nothing but his freedom. I would agree not to press criminal charges for the theft, provided he signed a strict non-disclosure agreement and a non-compete clause that banned him from working in the fitness industry in the state of Illinois for 10 years. Option 2. I would call the police right now. I would have him arrested for corporate embezzlement in front of the entire staff. I would sue him for the debt, take his condo, take his car, and garnish his wages for the rest of his life. I would ensure that his mugshot was on the front page of every business journal in Chicago. Gavin looked at the papers. He looked at the phone on the table, the threat of the police hanging over him. He looked at me, searching for a shred of the friend he used to know. But that friend was gone. That friend had died the moment I saw him kissing my wife on the security footage. He saw only a CEO making a business decision to remove a liability. He picked up the pen. His hand was trembling so badly he could barely hold it. He signed the resignation. He signed over his shares. He signed the non-compete. He signed away 7 years of work because he was too greedy to be loyal. I took the papers and placed them in my briefcase. I pressed the intercom button on the table and asked security to come to the boardroom. 2 uniformed guards arrived within seconds. I did not look at Gavin as I gave the order. I told them to escort Mr. Pearson to his office to collect his personal effects, and only his personal effects, and then to escort him out of the building. I instructed them to collect his building pass and his company credit cards. Gavin stood up. He looked like a ghost. He tried to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a curse, but the words caught in his throat. He turned and walked out the door, flanked by the guards. I watched him go. I watched the door close behind him. I was alone in the boardroom. The company was mine. The threat was neutralized. The parasite had been excised. I sat back down in the chair at the head of the table. I felt a wave of exhaustion hit me, heavy and suffocating. I had won the battle in the boardroom, but the victory felt hollow. I had saved my empire, but I had to burn down the village to do it. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a notification from the front desk security. Gavin had left the building. He was gone. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sterile air of the office. I had 1 hour before the staff meeting I had called. I had to explain to my employees why their VP of sales was gone. I had to reassure the investors. I had to be the strong leader they needed. But first, I needed to prepare for the next fight. Because while Gavin was broken, Elena was still out there. And her mother, a woman with venom in her veins and connections in the family court system, was undoubtedly plotting her next move. The business was safe, but my children were the next target. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and wrote down 2 names, Connor and Lily. The boardroom slaughter was over. The war for my family was about to begin. I picked up my pen. I was ready. The silence in my house was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of secrets. It was the silence of a fortress under siege. It had been 72 hours since I removed Gavin from the company, and 72 hours since Elena had been escorted off the property by the police. I thought the business takeover was the climax of the war, but I was wrong. That was just a skirmish. The real war was for my children, and the enemy general was not my wife. It was her mother, Lorraine. Lorraine Mitchell was a fixture in the Highland Park social scene, a woman who treated reputation like a currency more valuable than gold. She did not care that her daughter was an adulterer and a thief. She only cared that the family name was being dragged through the mud. She launched a counteroffensive that was breathtaking in its cruelty. She did not fight me with facts. She fought me with whispers. She planted stories in the local community blogs. She told the other mothers at the country club that I was a controlling monster who had snapped. She claimed I was financially abusive, citing the frozen credit cards as proof that I was starving her daughter into submission. She spun the narrative that I had locked a grieving, confused woman out of her home in the middle of the night due to a psychotic break brought on by work stress. I stopped reading the messages. I stopped answering the phone. I focused entirely on Connor and Lily. My son was angry, a quiet, simmering rage that reminded me of myself. My daughter, Lily, was confused and heartbroken, missing her mother but terrified of the tension. I sat them down and told them the truth. Not the ugly details of the affair, but the reality of the situation. I told them that Mom and I were going to court and that they might have to talk to a judge. I promised them that no matter what happened, they would be safe. The court date for the emergency custody hearing arrived on a rainy Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the confrontation. The courthouse was a gray monolith of stone and misery. I walked in with Richard by my side. Elena was already there, sitting with her new attorney, a man known for playing dirty in high-asset divorces. But Lorraine was the one who drew my eye. She sat behind Elena, her hand on her daughter's shoulder, staring at me with a hatred that could peel paint. Elena looked pale and fragile, dressed in modest colors, playing the role of the victimized housewife to perfection. The hearing began, and their strategy was immediately clear. They were not denying the affair. They were dismissing it as a symptom of my neglect. Her lawyer painted a picture of me as an absentee father, a man married to his business who left his poor wife lonely and desperate. They argued that my erratic behavior, locking her out, seizing the bank accounts, firing her business partner, proved I was unstable and unfit to have primary custody. They demanded full custody for Elena, possession of the marital home, and temporary spousal support of $15,000 a month. It was a compelling story. If I had been the judge, I might have believed it. But stories crumble under the weight of data. When it was our turn, Richard stood up. He did not raise his voice. He simply connected my laptop to the courtroom display. We did not focus on the infidelity. Infidelity is rarely a deciding factor in custody cases anymore. Instead, we focused on negligence. I had compiled a timeline using the same security logs and credit card statements that had exposed the affair. I showed the court a pattern of behavior that was not just immoral, but dangerous. I presented the log from 3 weeks prior. Elena had left the house at 7 in the evening on a school night. She told the kids she was going to a charity event. She did not return until 10 the next morning. During that time, Lily, who was 14, had suffered a severe asthma attack. The log showed Lily calling her mother 8 times between 9 and 10 at night. Every call went to voicemail. Elena was not at a charity event. She was at a casino hotel 40 miles away with Gavin. Her phone turned off to avoid detection. I had to leave a business dinner to rush Lily to the urgent care because her mother was unreachable. I showed another instance where she left the 17-year-old, Connor, alone for an entire weekend while I was at a conference, claiming she was staying with her mother. Lorraine had covered for her then, but the geolocation data from her car proved she was actually in Wisconsin at a resort. Connor had been left with no food in the house and no transportation. The courtroom grew quiet. The narrative of the devoted mother was disintegrating, but the final nail in the coffin was not a document. It was a video. I played the footage from the night of the confrontation, not the part where I locked her out, but the footage from the interior camera earlier that day. It showed Elena on the phone with Gavin, unaware she was being recorded. She was laughing. She was talking about how she couldn't wait to get custody so she could use the child support payments to fund their new venture once they pushed me out. She referred to the children as bargaining chips. She said, explicitly, that she would dump them on the nanny as soon as the check cleared. I watched Elena as the video played. She shrank into her chair. Lorraine looked away, her face a mask of stone, realizing her carefully constructed lies were being exposed as fraudulent. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Reynolds, looked from the screen to Elena. Her expression was one of pure disdain. But the most powerful testimony did not come from me. It came from my children. Judge Reynolds ordered an in-camera interview with Connor and Lily, speaking to them privately in her chambers without the parents present. I waited in the hallway for 45 minutes. It was the longest 45 minutes of my life. I paced the marble floor, wondering if my relationship with my son and daughter was strong enough to withstand the pressure Lorraine had surely put on them. When the judge returned to the bench, she did not hesitate. She looked at Elena and spoke with a voice like cutting steel. She stated that based on the evidence of consistent neglect, the demonstrated intent to monetize the children for personal gain, and the strong preference expressed by the teenage children, she was ruling immediately. I was granted sole legal and physical custody of Connor and Lily. Elena was granted supervised visitation 2 hours a week at a court-approved facility. She was ordered to vacate the marital home immediately. Her request for spousal support was denied pending the full investigation into the $50,000 she had embezzled from the family business. Elena dissolved into tears, real tears this time, as the reality of her loss crashed down on her. She reached for Lorraine, but her mother pulled away, gathering her purse and standing up. Lorraine whispered something to her daughter, likely a reprimand for getting caught, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. She abandoned her daughter the moment she became a liability, just as she had tried to teach Elena to abandon me. We walked out of the courthouse into the cool afternoon air. Connor and Lily were waiting in the designated area with the court-appointed guardian. When they saw me, they didn't ask what happened. They saw the relief on my face. Lily ran to me and hugged me tighter than she ever had. Connor stood tall, nodded, and put a hand on my shoulder. We were a broken unit, yes, but we were still standing. We were free. As we drove away, my phone buzzed with a news alert. It was a small item in the local business journal, but it caught my eye. It was about Gavin. The article mentioned that a local fitness executive had been blacklisted from the industry following allegations of corporate fraud and a breach of fiduciary duty. It noted that he was currently facing multiple lawsuits from creditors. I learned later that he had tried to secure a job at a rival gym chain, but the non-compete I forced him to sign, combined with the radioactive reputation I had ensured he carried, made him unemployable. He was currently working the counter at a car rental agency near the airport, living in a studio apartment that cost less than the suit he had worn to destroy my life. The collapse was complete. The conspirators were scattered. My wife was homeless and disgraced. My former partner was ruined. The empire of lies they had built had fallen, brick by brick. I looked in the rearview mirror at my children. They were quiet, looking out the window at the city passing by. I knew the road ahead would be hard. There was trauma to heal and trust to rebuild. But for the first time in months, the steering wheel was in my hands, and the path forward was mine to choose. I drove us home, to the house that was finally, truly, ours. 8 months had passed since the gavel fell in Judge Reynolds' courtroom. The seasons had changed, turning the gray slush of a Chicago winter into the vibrant green of early summer. The house in Highland Park, once a mausoleum of lies and tension, had transformed. The air inside was lighter now. The silence was no longer heavy with unsaid words or hidden agendas. It was the peaceful silence of a home where the occupants were actually safe. I sat on the back deck with a cup of coffee, watching Connor shoot hoops in the driveway. The rhythm of the basketball bouncing against the pavement was steady and strong, a heartbeat of normalcy that we had fought so hard to regain. The divorce had been finalized in June. It was a clinical end to an 18-year mistake. Because of the proven theft and the pre-existing deed to the house, the settlement was minimal. Elena received a small lump sum, enough to rent an apartment and buy a used car, but nothing close to the lifestyle she had felt entitled to. The forensic audit of the business had revealed the full extent of her and Gavin's greed. Nearly $60,000 misappropriated. The court had factored that debt into the division of assets, essentially leaving her with the scraps of the life she had torched. Ironclad Athletics was thriving in a way it never had before. Without Gavin's dead weight and his constant siphoning of funds for marketing expenses that never materialized, our profit margins had increased by 30%. I promoted Sarah, the operations manager who had alerted me to the weird scheduling anomalies initially, to vice president. She was brilliant, loyal, and actually did the work. We had just opened our 6th location in Naperville, a state-of-the-art facility that was fully subscribed before we even cut the ribbon. The business was no longer just a source of income. It was a source of pride again. The most difficult part of the rebuilding process had not been the finances, but the children. The betrayal had left deep scars on Connor and Lily. For the first few months, Connor was angry at the world. He felt foolish for not seeing the signs sooner, for trusting the adults who were supposed to protect him. We spent hours in therapy, both individually and together. Slowly, the anger began to morph into a quiet resilience. He channeled his energy into his sport and his grades. He secured a partial scholarship to the state university for the fall. When the acceptance letter arrived, he didn't call his mother. He walked into my office, handed me the paper, and simply shook my hand before pulling me into a hug. It was a moment of pure, unspoken vindication. Lily was doing better, too. She had joined the debate team, finding a voice she didn't know she had. The nightmares about the family falling apart had stopped. She still saw Elena for supervised visits every other weekend, but she came back from those afternoons exhausted rather than comforted. Elena was living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment near the airport, working as a receptionist at a dental office. According to Lily, Elena spent most of the visitation time complaining about how unfair the judge was and asking questions about me, who I was seeing, how the business was doing. Lily, to her credit, had learned the art of the gray rock method. She gave her mother nothing but monosyllabic answers, refusing to be a conduit for Elena's jealousy. As for Gavin, he had vanished from the Chicago fitness scene entirely. The last I heard, the lawsuits from his creditors had stripped him of his condo and his luxury car. He had moved to Arizona to live with a cousin, working in timeshare sales. He had tried to reach out to me once, a long, rambling email sent at 2 in the morning, blaming Elena for seducing him and claiming he was the real victim. I didn't even finish reading it. I simply forwarded it to my attorney to add to the file and hit delete. He was a ghost, a bad memory that faded a little more with every sunrise. But the biggest surprise of the last 8 months was not the business or the legal victories. It was Andrea. I had met her at a Chamber of Commerce event in the city. She owned a logistics company, a self-made woman who had built her own empire from the ground up. We started with coffee, which turned into dinner, which turned into long walks along the lakefront where we talked about everything except our exes. Andrea was different. She didn't need my money. She had her own. She didn't need my status. She had her own reputation. She challenged me. She paid for her own drinks. She looked me in the eye and saw Jason the man, not Jason the ATM. We were taking it slow. I introduced her to the kids only last month. We had a barbecue in the backyard. I watched from the grill as Andrea laughed at one of Connor's jokes and helped Lily with a painting project. There was no performance, no trying too hard. It was just easy. For the first time in years, I looked at a woman in my home and didn't feel a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I felt hope. The final closure came on a Tuesday evening, almost exactly a year after the night Elena had walked out in her burgundy dress. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when the doorbell rang. I checked the security camera. It was Elena. She was standing on the porch, not in a designer dress, but in jeans and a tired-looking coat. She looked older, harder. The shine was gone. I walked to the door, but didn't open it. I spoke to her through the intercom system. I asked her what she wanted. She looked at the camera, knowing I was watching. She started to cry, but it wasn't the manipulative performance of the courtroom. It was the desperate weeping of a woman who had realized too late that she had thrown away a diamond to pick up a stone. She told me she was sorry. She told me that Gavin had abandoned her the moment the money ran out. She said she missed her home. She missed us. She asked if we could just talk, if she could come in for 5 minutes to explain things, to maybe start over. She invoked the 18 years we had spent together. She begged me to remember the good times. I stood there in the warmth of my kitchen, the smell of roasting chicken filling the air, the sound of my daughter practicing her violin upstairs. I looked at the woman on the screen and searched my heart for any lingering feeling. I looked for anger, for love, even for pity. But I found nothing. There was only a vast, cool indifference. She was a stranger to me, a stranger who had tried to destroy my children's future for a cheap thrill and a quick buck. I pressed the talk button one last time. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer comfort. I simply told her that there was nothing left to discuss. I told her that the time for talking had passed the night she walked out that door and told me not to wait up. I reminded her that she was trespassing and that if she did not leave, I would have to call the police again. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the camera lens, waiting for me to crack, waiting for the old Jason to surface. But the old Jason was dead. He had been buried under the weight of her betrayal, and the man who stood there now was forged in the fire she had lit. She finally turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped, disappearing into the dark street. I watched her go until she was out of frame. Then, I turned off the monitor. I walked back to the stove and stirred the pot. Connor came downstairs, attracted by the smell of food. He asked who was at the door. I looked at my son, saw the strength in his face, the future stretching out before him. I told him it was no one, just a salesperson selling something we didn't need. We sat down to dinner, the three of us. The house was warm. The conversation was easy. We laughed about something silly Lily had seen at school. We planned our upcoming trip to the lake house. I looked around the table, at the faces of the people I loved, and who loved me back with honesty and loyalty. I had lost a marriage, yes. I had lost a partner. But as I took a bite of the meal I had made in the home I had saved, I realized I hadn't really lost anything. I had simply pruned the rot from the tree so it could finally grow. I was happy, and for the first time in a long time, that happiness wasn't a hope. It was a fact. The empire of lies was gone. The life of truth had begun.